My name is Monica Vakili. Welcome to Iranian Culture Association in Washington, D.C. کانون دوستداران فرهنگ ایران در واشنگتن دی سی و هومه. تاریخ امروز اکتبر 18 2021 26 ماه مهر 1400. Today's date is October 18, 2021. Time is 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, USA. Name of our guest, Dr. Yerواند آبراهامیان. A subject of the speech, oil crisis in Iran, from nationalism to kudeta, and based on his last book. I would like to ask a young Iranian student who is studying and receiving history and has consulted books and the writing of our distinguished speaker to introduce Dr. Abrahamian. Miss Janan Iranbumi is a student in Georgetown University, joining us from Washington. She researches international law, history, and oil diplomacy in the Persian Gulf region. Our association invited her in the past to present her researches, and it is a pleasure to welcome her back to introduce our esteemed speaker, Purfesor آبراهامیان. جانان ایرانبومی. Please you start your introduction.
خیلی ممنون از کانون که به من این فرصت رو دادن این معرفی رو انجام بدم و اول من خواهم به فارسی معرفی استاد آبراهامیان رو معرفی کنم و بعد به انگلیسی و به عنوان کسی که خیلی علاقه‌مند هست به تاریخ ایران خیلی از این فرصتی که به من دادین که استاد آبراهامیان رو معرفی کنم ممنون هستم. پرفسور یرواند آبراهامیان تاریخ نگار ارمنی ایرانی هستند و در سال 1319 در تهران متولد شدند. ایشان تا کلاس سوم در تهران تحصیل کردند و بعد به انگلیس رفتن برای ادامه تحصیل در یک مدرسه شبانه روزی. درجه کارشناسی و کارشناسی ارشد خود را از دانشگاه آکسفورد گرفتن و برای دکترا به کلمبیا یونیورسیتی ادامه تحصیل دادند. در دانشگاه پرینستون یونیورسیتی و آکسفورد یونیورسیتی تدریس کردند و همکنون در بروک کالج در نیویورک استاد تاریخ هستند. کتابشون تاریخ ایران معاصر یکی از برجسته ترین تاریخ نگاران محسوب می شوند و یکی از کتابایی که خیلی تاثیرگذار بود در زمینه تاریخ مدرن ایران. دکتر آبراهامیان خودشون میگن من یک ایرانی ارمنی به دنیا آمدم، شکاک به خاطر آموزش‌های علمی، ترجیحاً یک سوسیال دموکرات در زمینه سیاسی و تا آنجا که مبانی مذهبی مربوط می شود در اغلب روزها بی تفاوت به نسبت بود و نبود خدا و در روزهای دیگر آتئیست هستند. ایشان نویسنده چندین کتاب از جمله کتاب ایران بین دو انقلاب و همچنین کتاب تاریخ ایران مدرن هستند. کتاب جدیدشون بحران نفت در ایران از ملی گرایی تا کودتا جدیدترین کتابشون هست و اساس سخنرانی امروز هستش و جهت آشنایی بیشتر با نگرش‌های تاریخی پرفسور آبراهامیان به مقاله‌ای که خسرو باقری نوشتن میتونین رجوع کنین و این رو میتونین در صفحه کانون پیدا بکنین. تمرکز این کتاب بر 28 ماه آشفته بین آوریل 1951 تا آگوست 1953 هستش. این کتاب بر اساس اسناد محرمانه هست که CIA و وزارت خارجه به تازگی انتشار کرده و توسط سازمان‌های CIA و وزارت خارجه این کتاب یک تحقیق جدیدی در مورد کودتای 28 مرداد، یک دید جدیدی در مورد این اتفاق تحقیق و معرفی میکنه. و من خیلی خوشحالم که این فرصت رو داریم امروز در این جلسه بیشتر در مورد تحقیقات استاد آبراهامیان یاد بگیریم و الان به انگلیسی هم من این معرفی رو میکنم. قبل از اینکه شما شروع کنین، Thank you to the Association for your kind introduction and inviting me to introduce today's esteemed speaker, Professor Abrahamian. I am very eager to hear about his research as someone who is greatly interested in the history of modern Iran, and having the chance to introduce one of the most prominent historians and author of several books. Professor Abrahamian is the author of several prominent books, including Iran Between Two Revolutions and A History of Modern Iran. And his most recent publication is Oil Crisis in Iran from Nationalism to Kudeta, which was published this summer. He is an Armenian-born Iranian, raised in England, and then pursued his bachelor's and master's degrees at Oxford University before receiving his PhD at Columbia University in New York. Professor Abrahamian taught at Princeton University, New York University, and Oxford University. In 2011, he was elected Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is currently Professor Emeritus of History at Baruch College and Graduate Center in the City University of New York. His research interests include the history and politics of the Middle East, primarily Iran. His most recent book, Oil Crisis in Iran from Nationalism to Kudeta, is a very prominent book, which will be the basis of today's speech. And according to himself, I'm quoting, "This is a new edition of declassified documents that throw light on how deeply the US was involved in the internal politics of Iran from the very beginning of the oil crisis, an involvement previously overlooked by both historians and informed observers," says Abrahamian himself. His book focuses on the turbulent 28 months between April 1951 and August 1953, and it's based on the recently declassified CIA and US State Department documents relating to the Mossadegh administration, and it tells the story of the Iranian oil crisis, which would then later culminate into the coup of August 1953. By shedding new light on the American involvement in Iran, Professor Abrahamian reveals how exactly the United States was involved in the internal politics long before the 1953 coup, in parliamentary politics and the monarchy in 1952. By assessing rival explanations for the coup from internal discontent, a fear of communism, and oil nationalization, Professor Abrahamian argues that the Truman and Eisenhower administrations did not differ significantly in their policies towards Mossadegh, but rather he emphasizes the role of the Shah himself. In tracing the key involvement of the US and the CIA in Iran, his study shows how the 1953 coup would eventually pave the way to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, two of the most significant and widely studied episodes of modern Iranian history. His books have been translated and published in Persian, Turkish, Arabic, Italian, and Polish, and he has just completed Oil Crisis in Iran from Negotiations to Coup this summer, and he is currently working on a new book on the 1979 revolution. Today's topic will be Oil Crisis in Iran from Nationalism to Kudeta, which is based on his recent book. And now, Professor Abrahamian, we are eager to learn more about this important and new research that you conducted.
Thank you very much, Janan Iranbumi. Now, Dr. Abrahamian, you have between 50 to 60 minutes for your presentation, and then we have audience comments, questions, and answers. Please start.
Thank you, Monica, Janan, for the introduction. Also, thank you, Manu Chair and Kanun, for inviting me to talk to you. You all probably know that there is a 30-year rule in the American system that 30 years after certain events, the classified documents can be declassified and published. So the period for the Mossadegh was supposed to have been declassified 30 years after 53. When they were eventually declassified a few years later, there was delay, there was long gaps about reporting from Washington to Tehran, Tehran to Washington, especially at times of major crisis. It was clearly clear that there must have been a lot of communications back and forth, but there was nothing in the documents that were declassified. In fact, in 1987, the State Department, in its annual called FRUS, the Foreign Relations of the United States, did publish 1,000 pages of documents on Iran for the Mossadegh period. But these documents were so flimsy, skimpy, with long gaps for periods, that it caused a major scandal in the American Historical Association. They were especially scandalized because there was nothing actually on the coup. But more important, there was long periods before the coup that there was no apparently communications between Tehran and Washington. So Congress and historian profession took this issue and pressured basically the State Department to agree that they would reissue the documents for this period, since it was considered a very important historical period for both the United States and Iran. So after much resistance, the State Department agreed that it would actually bring out a new issue. And also in the pressure to change, be more open, transparent, the 30-year rule was reduced to 25. And it was also agreed that the State Department would publish not only its own documents, but also relevant CIA national security documents about US-Iran. So historians like us eagerly waited to see this new edition of FRUS for the Mossadegh period. And a lot of false starts. Eventually, in 2017, just a few years ago, this volume did appear. Again, it's about 1,000 pages. There are still some gaps in it. And this basically becomes a new way of looking at the Mossadegh period. Now, when it was published, the general consensus among American historians, like Bachovich, who was a very good critical of American foreign policy, he argued that this was, again, a mockery, because he compared it to having the story of Genesis without the story of the serpent and the forbidden fruit in it. Why? Because the new volume had very little actually on the coup itself, Mr. Hashtem Mordad. So he was very disappointed because he was still looking for the more information about the coup. Similarly, Malcolm Byrd, who does wonderful work at the National Security Archive in declassifying documents, he was disappointed. He said, well, what was new about the new documents, that there was nothing new in them. Again, he was looking for Mr. Hashtem Mordad. Now, if you are looking for more details about 28 Mordad, the new 1,000 pages really doesn't have much on the coup itself. And one really doesn't need much new on the coup itself. The Donald Wilbur report that was done in 1954 for internal reading in the CIA by a person who was very much involved in the coup, I would say that's a good primary, reliable source for understanding the coup. And there are, of course, some details one could still look for. But as far as the general picture of the coup is concerned, we know actually all that one needs to know from the Wilbur report. So generally, the American historians, especially those interested in Iran, were disappointed by the new declassification of the documents. However, if you're a historian interested in Iranian politics, these documents are a gold mine of information. And what is striking, and I think the reason they were kept so secret for so long, was because the US was so deeply involved in internal Iranian politics before the coup. We all know that during the coup, after the coup, US was very much involved. But then the general impression is that US really had influence with the Shah at the very top, but wasn't interested in internal politics until after, during and after the coup. But what these documents show, in fact, that the US was deeply ingrained in nitty-gritty of Iranian politics right before and Mossadegh, during Mossadegh, and all the way through the Mossadegh period. And you can get an inkling of this if you compare a few documents that appeared in the old volume and the same document that appears in the new volume. In the old volume, sometimes you have a brief, almost a sentence or a paragraph that is still kept secret. So there's a gap in the original one. When you look at the new document, you find that the gap is there now. You can see what's there. And it's invariably US involvement in internal politics, which the US before did not want to get admitted to. They didn't want to accept that it had been involved in internal politics. So what I think that the new documents are important is the internal involvement of the US. Now, this actually comes out in three separate arenas you can see in the Mossadegh period. One is what we know about Siatir Qavam's attempt to replace Mossadegh with Qavam Siatir, which resulted in Siatir, the uprising and return of Mossadegh to power. Now, if you look at the internal documents here, you see that the US was deeply involved in actually bringing Qavam to power. In May of 1952, a top-level meeting was held in DC between Iran experts from Britain and United States, State Departments, CIA, about who to replace Mossadegh with. And they had 18 candidates. It's like they were looking for a new recruit for a department chair or something. And they looked at CVs of 18 candidates to see who would be more suitable to replace Mossadegh. I won't go through the 18, but the name Qavam often came up. Here, it was admitted that Qavam was very old. He had a reputation of nepotism, corruption, but general consensus was that he would be a suitable person because he was amenable to come to an agreement with United States about oil. Lo and behold, soon after that, Henderson, the American ambassador, bumps into Rawam, supposedly by coincidence, at a reception and agrees to have a personal dinner with him in Tehran, in which again they discuss about the issue of oil. And it's after that pressure, and you can see this in the British documents too, both the British embassy and American embassy lobby strongly inside Iran to get Rawam as prime minister. And this is when Mossadegh actually gets wind of what was happening and brings in the issue of control over the army. He resigns. Rawam is quickly elected by narrow majority in the Majlis as prime minister. That results in the uprising of Siatir. Then the uprising causes the Shah, in fact, to get cold feet. In fact, he feels that if the uprising continues, it's going to result in the overthrow of the monarchy. He withdraws the army from the streets, and Rawam has no choice but to resign. So here is one case you can see where there is direct US involvement. In fact, the US embassy after that was very pissed off at the Shah that he withdrew the troops from the street. The Americans felt that if he had continued, persevered, he would have been able to crush the opposition. The Shah didn't agree to that. And the Shah was probably right. And in fact, he found American and diplomats and British diplomats later saying that if it had continued, you could have very well had another 1917 in Iran, not just removal of Rawam, but actually an overthrow. So here is one case you can see the direct involvement of the US. A second area of involvement is, which we didn't know about, but I think the documents show clearly, is what is known as the incident of Noah Isfahan, 28th of February, when the Shah had packed up his bags, literally had packed up his bags to leave the country. The reason he'd done that was that Mossadegh had found evidence that there was a link between the Darbar and Bakhtiari uprising. The Bakhtiaris had ambushed a whole column of Iranian troops in Bakhtiari area. Some 60 people had been killed, officers and soldiers. Mossadegh had the evidence. He was willing to go to the public with that evidence. Of course, it would have been very damning to the court if this was public knowledge that the people in the court was actually supporting the killing of Iranian troops in around Isfahan. And the Shah then actually said, if you keep quiet, I'm willing to leave the country. At that point, Henderson intervened and said, basically, I will leak this information to other people who will then protest and organize a protest, mostly Chagukeshan and retired officers around the palace and around the Mossadegh's house. So that became the famous incident of Noah Isfahan. And after that, the Shah, in fact, decided not to leave because of the intervention of Henderson. Later on, in fact, he wrote a letter to Henderson thanking him for having saved the monarchy. And he said if it hadn't been for Henderson, that would have been the end of the monarchy in February of 1952. And in fact, he reported this to the National Security Council in Washington. The third area related where US was very much involved was in Majlis politics, which we really didn't know, have inkling of. We knew that US spent money in the press, had, of course, access to the Shah, had the CIA influence in army officers. But we really had no knowledge that how extensive US influence was in the 17th Majlis elections. You can see this in the reporting. The embassy, as well as the British embassy, kept very close tabs on the electoral process, on who was getting elected, who were the deputies, and what was going on in the Majlis. And throughout this period, you find that the US is trying to actually undermine Mossadegh through the parliamentary process. And the reason is doing that, I'll get to when I get to the Shah towards the end of the talk. US and British tactics was to basically undermine the prime minister through the parliamentary process rather than the military process. And this process went on right through the 17th Majlis. They couldn't do this except for the short period where Yerواند came in. So the result was obstructionism, very systematic obstructionism, where Roosevelt, in fact, advised the opposition in the Majlis how to carry out obstructionism so no laws could be passed. Every time there were some 300 bills, reform bills, ready to be submitted to the Majlis. Every time there was one submitted, the deputies would go out of the chamber. Some would say they had to go to a pilgrimage to Rome or somewhere, and so there could not be a quorum. So it was the result of this long process of obstructionism that led Mossadegh eventually to call for the deputies to resign and then to have a referendum to basically close the Majlis. So that drastic action which Mossadegh had to take, which was really not in the constitution, the referendum, was a result of the systematic obstructionism directed by the US and also by the British. So these are three areas that you can see direct involvement. What also the documents actually confirm, they don't reveal new, but they would confirm something that I've argued, but others don't agree with, was that one, US from the beginning was really not supportive of Mossadegh. The claim was, of course, and later historians say that Truman was quite happy to have Mossadegh. What they wanted was a compromise, and they offered a compromise to Iran, and Mossadegh should have accepted this compromise. But what the new documents show, that in fact there was never any compromise. What the US was offering was the nationalization in name, but in reality, the oil company would remain in the hands, out of the hands of Iran, either back to the British or a consortium of British and other foreign enterprises. So there was never sort of an agreement that, oh, we accept nationalization. This was a phony acceptance. The reality was always very insistent, and these are the new documents show, that control of the industry should not be in the hands of Iran. So this was, I think, the documents confirm this argument. Another confirmation you find in these documents is, again, back to the issue of how important was communism. Of course, the discourse of the time was Cold War. And if you wanted to make any argument legitimate, you would say, well, you know, communist danger. As some people have said, if the Dulleses wanted to throw their grandmother under the bus, they would say it was necessary to save the world from communism. Similarly with Iran, it's, again, many people still argue, well, the coup occurred because it was during the Cold War and there was the fear of communism. Again, in the documents, and here is the CIA documents are important. The CIA analysis of the two-day party was that it could organize demonstrations, it could organize strikes, but it was not a position to carry out a coup or a revolution, and there was no preparation by the Tudeh to carry out a coup. The policy of the Tudeh was actually to support Mossadegh. So here again, the documents actually reinforce or undermine the conventional wisdom of the idea that the coup was a reaction to the Soviet or to the communist threat. Here, and another interesting thing that comes out in the documents is where you can talk about a hidden state or hidden state within a state. Throughout the Mossadegh period, there is a constant back and forth between the diehards that control the Iran desk in the CIA, Allen Dulles, Roosevelt, Wilbur. These are the people who do carry out the coup in 53. And we usually think that, well, they come in with Roosevelt, and when the change of administration in Washington occurs, there's a change of policy. But these people are actually running the Iran desk as early as April 1951 under Truman. And what they're arguing constantly from the beginning is that the only way to deal with Mossadegh is to get rid of him. They want the Shah to get rid of him, but to say, if not the Shah, some sort of coup or military removal of him. And what then you have another group of people, many of them more from the academic world. Some are in the CIA, some are in the State Department, people like Kyler Young, Upton, who are much more down to earth. They argued that Mossadegh represents basically history, the future. It represents the middle class. We should then basically try to deal with him. And there is no real communist danger to worry about. So the Roosevelt people know that there is no communist danger, but they're constantly using this as an argument to change the national estimates. The National Security Council often has estimates of what's happening in each country. And every time the estimate comes up to write on Iran, there is a back and forth between, you can say, these hidden state group of people who want to be alarmist and talk about that Iran is basically disintegrating, we have to do something. And the more down-to-earth people who argued, no, things are okay, things are fine, there is no danger of basically either disintegration or overthrow. So that's actually quite revealing that this goes back and forth. And eventually, of course, the CIA diehards win out, but it's not because the arguments are there, it's because other shifts that occur to bring them into play. But the important thing is actually under Truman, these policies are already there in the CIA. It's not something that comes in under Eisenhower. The difference between the Truman and the Eisenhower administration is that the Truman administration, especially with Henderson, they wanted to get rid of Mossadegh, but they wanted to get rid of him politically. And it's only when the political system, the route failed, the Majlis route failed, the Ravam route failed, that they resorted to the military option. Also a small indication, but it shows actually something deeper. Even before Mossadegh is elected prime minister in April 51, there is a CIA report saying that we should spend more money in Tehran, presumably in the press or in the Majlis, to make sure that Mossadegh is not elected prime minister. So the idea that somehow later on the US got disenamored with Mossadegh because he was obstructionist and refused to deal with a compromise. This is actually belied by the fact that even before Mossadegh was elected, they were trying to actually prevent his election. Now, to complete the talk, I would like to actually bring out two other things that are significant in the documents that people have not really looked at before. One is the role of the Shah. Usually, the Shah is seen as a Hamlet figure who can't make up his mind, weak, not too intelligent. And this is, of course, reinforced by American attitude as a result of the '79 revolution, putting the blame on the Shah. If he had been more competent, things would not have happened the way they were. What I'm struck by is actually the Shah's astuteness and savviness, much more savvy than the foreign ambassadors and much more savvy than most of his advisors. Right from the beginning, as soon as Mossadegh is elected prime minister, the US and Britain are eager to persuade the Shah to get rid of Mossadegh. And the Shah is clear his opposition to this, and he remains actually very consistent. He's not wavering. Throughout the period, he is very consistent on this. He argues that if I go against Mossadegh, if I go against oil nationalization, I will, in fact, destroy my monarchy and the monarchy as a whole. Why? Because he recognizes that Mossadegh and oil nationalization really represents Iranian nationalism, national aspirations. It's equivalent to other countries gaining their independence from colonialism. And if any head of state actually goes against the national independence, he is going to bury his own throne. He keeps on saying this. And throughout the period, he is in fact saying, well, if you have to get rid of Mossadegh, do it politically, do it through the Majlis, but I'm not going to get involved in a military coup. And he remains that way until the very end, when basically they give him an ultimatum. The US gives him an ultimatum saying, if you don't go along with this, we're going to go along anyway, and one of your brothers will replace you. This is as blunt, mafia type of ultimatum that he is given. And this is basically, I think, the last basically pressure that buckled under. He went along with it, and he was very perceptive because, as I end up arguing, the original sin of the regime was, in fact, the coup. This more than destabilized the regime, it delegitimized the regime. And therefore, it made the regime throughout the period, even with the oil money, all the building of the military, it lacked basically legitimacy in the eyes of the public, to the point that when you had a small crisis in 77, 78, you can't even call it an economic crisis, a little recession, a little pressure about torture, the system began to unravel. A normal system, any regime with some legitimacy could have easily overcome minor problems of 77, 78. But the regime could not survive those as minor issues because it lacked legitimacy. And here you can see that in some of the American reports. Sullivan, Stempel, who was Sullivan's assistant, says during the height of the revolution, well, there's no the one the Shah can negotiate with in the opposition because they don't consider him legitimate. Why? He doesn't say why. And I won't go into reasons why there's an American amnesia about 53, but he, as a deputy ambassador, he couldn't say the fault is the coup of 53. He just says the Shah does not have legitimacy. Similarly, actually, Polk, who was in the State Department for all this period, wrote a book, Understanding Iran. He says, in fact, he ends up his book saying that the Shah fell in 79 because he lost legitimacy in 1953. So in that way, I would say the Shah was very perceptive. It's just he made the mistake of nailing himself to the chariot wheels of US imperialism and betted unknown or against his own better judgment, taking part in a coup that undermined his own position. So I would just conclude, therefore, that even though these documents, don't tell you much new about the coup itself, they do reveal a great deal about US involvement. And surprisingly enough, I think the Shah comes out as looking much more politically savvy than one would expect. And he persisted in being very savvy until he was forced, basically, his hand was forced by that. And I won't go into all the sort of somersaults he did after 53 to gain legitimacy because he knew he lost it. And all of them actually further undermined his position, whether it was the White Revolution or trying to become the American gendarme in the Persian Gulf. These all reinforced the view that he was a foreign puppet rather than a leader of an independent state. So I will end there. I hope I didn't go over too much over my time. So is someone going to moderate the questions or?
Yes, Monica, please unmute yourself.
Yes, is it recording? It's not recording.
I'm gonna pause the recording.
Yes, please.
خب نفر اول من هستم.
بله. Mr. Mobin. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abrahamian. That was very impressive presentation, and I learned that there is three points that you mentioned: Sietir, Nohe Esfand, and parliamentary election. That previously known that America was not involved or was very passive at that period of time, but the new document shows that no, they were active on that. And the other elements, it's very revealing that, especially the time that you mentioned that the CIA had analysis that to the party was not in the process of doing any coup or anything and didn't have power to do anything on that thing. But we hear from a lot of historians that they said, oh, because Mossad was, have sympathy toward the party, so they want to save Iran from communism. which is not true. And I thank you for the presentation. My question is, go back to what Steve Kinzer in his book mentioned, that 1953 coup was the basis of what happened in 1979, the revolution that happened in Iran. The root of them is in 1953, because after 1953, all the democratic forces was crushed. The only forces that could have grown in that period of 20-some years was the religious forces that grown, but the nationalists, the leftists, all of them was crushed in Iran during that time. So I want to see, how do you link 1953 coup to the 1979 revolution? Thank you very much.
Dr. Abrahamian, because there is almost 20 raised hand, you can answer. I call two people and each of them, they speak 3 minutes, and then you have 5 minutes to answer to both of them. Second person, Fariba Amini. Fariba Amini.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Now
Yes.
I have, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Abrahamian, and thank you, Kanun Dostaran Farhang Iran, for having this talk. I have two very quick questions. One is, you mentioned in one of your books about the role of Anne Lambton in the coup, but unfortunately, there's very little documents about Anne Lambton or her role in the coup. Could you probably get into more detail about her role, and why hasn't anyone really written any biography of Anne Lambton? And then my second question is, why didn't the Soviets return the gold to Iran until after the coup? Before the coup, I think Dr. Mossadegh's government wanted the gold that was in the Soviet hands to be returned to Iran, but the Soviets decided to return it after the coup. Could you possibly talk about these two issues? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Abrahamian, please, 5 minutes.
Yes, actually, good questions. I'll start with the last one since they're fresh in the conversation. We don't know about what happened in the discussions between the Mossadegh government and the Soviet Union, when it started and so on. It could be very well that the Russians would have been happy to start negotiations earlier, but the initiative was held back by the Mossadegh period until it realized that basically they couldn't deal with the United States, and they turned to the Soviet Union to discussion. Of course, the discussions started and they continued, and when they ended, the gold was returned. And often this is actually seen as something very sinister, that the compensation about World War II went on from the war ended in 1945, and it didn't end till 1954. So a long time. But the new CIA documents show that actually the US and Iran were quibbling about World War II compensation even in the 1970s. So even the US had some discussions and difficulties in agreeing who owed what to who during the war. We would need to actually look at both the Iranian documents and the Soviet documents to see whether it was the Soviets that were holding back, or it was Mossad that wasn't eager to deal with the Soviets earlier. There is, in fact, an important act called the Battle Act of the United States, which Henderson read to Mossadegh, saying that if Mossadegh began to sell or deal with the Soviet countries, he could not get any aid from United States. So, of course, we know Mossadegh was trying to get some aid from United States throughout 52, even in early 53. And that was the Battle Act was a real threat for him, a deterrent for him to normalize relations with Soviet Union, especially economically. So it's easier to say, well, the Soviets were acting sinister, but there may have been more complications about the question of gold. Lambton. There is actually a biography of Lambton by John Gurney in the Encyclopedia Britannica recently. Her role in the coup was personally advisory. We know from the documents that as soon as Mossadegh was elected, Lambton, like much of the British Foreign Office, concluded that Mossadegh was actually serious about nationalization. He was not going to back down or accept some sort of facade of nationalization. And therefore, the only way to deal with it was to replace him. So she was consistent on that. Whether she actually had any role in the coup itself, there's no evidence of that because she was about that time in England and was not really involved in that. What we do know, actually, she came to Iran soon after the coup, and her reports on the Shah are very damning, very derogatory. So much so that the British embassy basically ignored her because she was seen as a troublemaker with her anti-Shah analysis. She said she couldn't find anyone in Iran who supported the Shah after the coup. So she's not really a royalist. I would see herself as a British imperialist who felt that Britain should control the oil, and that Mossadegh was a genuine nationalist and therefore a troublemaker for the British Empire.
Thank you.
So Kinzer, going back to Kinzer, yeah, I agree with the link between 53 and 79, but I would say the link is stronger than just the breakdown of secular organizations. That's true. But I think the stronger argument is what the 53 coup did was delegitimize the whole system, not just the monarchy, even the constitution. Because by 78, 79, very few people are really talking about return to the constitution, the monarchy, the limited Shah, and so on. That has all gone discredited by the 53 coup. And I won't go into Weberian analysis, but I think when you have a vacuum in legitimacy, where the regime has no legitimacy, either traditional legitimacy, or you can say bureaucratic legitimacy, Weberian notion of rational regime. When there's a vacuum like that is when you get the emergence of charisma. Some guy comes up and says, you know, the law says this, but I speak from God or I speak from above and I tell you this and this is right. What was said in the past can be disregarded. And this is basically where Khomeini's charisma comes from. And this again goes back to the destruction of legitimacy by 53.
Thank you very much. Janan Iranbumi and then Javad Molai. 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. I'm very thrilled to learn more about the importance of the recently declassified CIA and State Department sources, but we also know that the UK was an important actor in their involvement in Iran during this time, and that they have yet to declassify their documents. While they are a very important actor, they have not publicized documents that relate to this event. And specifically because Iran and the UK had the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which Mossadegh nationalized in 1952, to then have the National Iranian Oil Company. I was wondering if you can emphasize more on how the British involvement can be studied now, like retroactively, given that there's not many sources, and specifically contextualizing that with Iran's victory at the International Court of Justice, also 1952, in which the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of Iran to continue the oil nationalization of Iran's oil company. So yes, we have new documents on the American involvement in specific individuals like Kermit Roosevelt who were involved. How can your methodology explain parts of British involvement during Iran during this time? And I'm just gonna ask my question in Farsi very quick as well. سوال من این هستش که ما میدونیم انگلیس خیلی سهم زیادی داشت در ایران برای کودتای 28 مرداد، ولی هنوز اسناد تاریخی که به این اتفاق ربط دارن رو عمومی نکردن. چطوری ما میتونیم یک تصویر کاملی در مورد این اتفاق داشته باشیم وقتی که انگلیس هنوز منابع تاریخی در مورد این موضوع هنوز مخفی نگه داشته؟
خیلی ممنون. آقای جواد مولایی 3 minutes.
سلام به همگی. خیلی ممنون از شما آقای دکتر آبراهامیان. خیلی صحبت جالب و خوبی بود برای من. خیلی خوشحالم که آمدم و از کانون دوستداران فرهنگ ایران هم خیلی ممنونم که این برنامه رو ترتیب دادن. I recently read somewhere that before the kudeta there was a discussion in British Parliament to reinvigorate the 1907 treaty. This time now with Soviet Union. 1907 was with Russia. But my question is there any do you know if there is any validity to that? And did the United States take this seriously as planning for the coup d'etat? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Abrahamian, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, I've never heard of the talk about 1907 agreement. Where there was some discussion was when oil was nationalized in May of 51, early on, the British talked about invading Khuzestan, taking over Khuzestan and the oil wells and the refinery. And that would have automatically triggered off not 1907, but 1921 Iranian-Soviet treaty, because by 1921 treaty, the Soviets had the right to enter Iran if any third power invaded Iran from elsewhere. So that was a good, in fact, a good umbrella for Iran to point out that if there was a British invasion, that would lead to a Soviet invasion from the north. So some may sort of fantasized separation, partition of Iran between the Soviets and Britain in early period. But that was never really pursued. The British soon gave up the idea of invading Khuzestan for a number of reasons. One, they no longer had the Indian army to do that. Lord Mountbatten, who had been Viceroy of India, he said basically there's no way Britain could invade southern Iran without the Indian army. So this was not, you couldn't go back to early 20th century gunboat type of the diplomacy. And there were other reasons that the British realized it was not practical to invade Khuzestan. You could, even if you invaded, how are you going to run the oil industry? It could be easily sabotaged, pipelines could be blown up, and so on. So that was not a practical thing. The idea of a partition really was never implemented. That was always the fear, especially in Iran, that Iran could be divided as it had been in 1907, but it was never a serious proposal either in Britain, or I'm sure the Russians weren't thinking along those lines either. So the other question was
the British involvement.
Oh, the British. Okay, one problem is U.S. has this 30-year rule that applies not just State Department, but also to National Security Council, the CIA. There is no such thing in Britain. There is a 30-year rule for Foreign Office documents, not for MI5, MI6. In fact, until recently, Britain didn't even recognize that there was such a thing as MI6. It now admits that there was a MI6, but very little MI6 documents actually see the day of light. They're not in the practice of publicizing what goes on or what they did, and they probably don't keep much records of dirty work like coups. So there is, I don't think, that much primary documents, internal documents. But what you do have are memoirs. And what you do have is like the Wilbur Report. The Wilbur Report is quite open about the British role in it. And although he credits the CIA as the primary mover, he admits that without the British input in the coup, it couldn't have occurred. Here, actually, it's interesting. His argument is when the Americans thought about a coup, they had to, of course, find out army officers who were willing to do it. And even though America had been training Iranian officers, they didn't have biographies of army officers. To get biographies of army officers, they had to go to the British, and the British had been always keeping biographies of what makes people tick, what are their weaknesses, what are their strengths, who are their friends, what are their politics. And we know from the British embassy documents, not MI5 and MI6, we don't have access to that, but from the embassy documents, it is clear that the British were keeping a very keen eye on the Iranian military and who was in the military right from 1941. So when it came to 1953 to carry out the coup, they knew exactly who was who could be approached, who was already in the MI6 payroll, who wasn't, who was leftist. There's no, and this is why actually the British were very confident there was no possibility of a two-day takeover, because they knew the army, although the crucial parts of the army had been, in fact, cleansed of two-day influence. Today, any officer who had seen to have leftist tendencies was often marginalized to Baluchistan or somewhere to the provinces. So there were few commissioned army officers, especially in tank brigades, that had leftist connections, one or two, but the bulk of the trained officers were in fact quite right-wing, and the British knew about that. And in fact, the crucial person in the Iranian part of the coup, which didn't get credit later on, was Colonel Akhavi, who had been in charge of Deuxième G2 in the army, and his role was in fact to keep an eye on the army officers. He also worked closely with MI6, so his role was in fact very crucial in the final days, that he could give the Shah directly a name of 40 officers who were willing to participate in the coup. And that was also a clincher for the Shah, because the Shah was too smart to be bluffed by Zahedi, who claimed he had the whole country behind him. He had umpteen army officers willing to sacrifice themselves for the Shah. The Shah wasn't willing to buy that type of talk. But when Akhavi presented the Shah with actually 40 real names of people in the barracks around Tehran who were willing to participate, that also for the Shah was a clincher to go along with the coup.
Thank you. Shukufe Vakili and Goli. 3 minutes, please.
I don't know what happened to Shukufe. She disappeared. So I'm gonna
put it Goli and Puyan.
Well.
Professor Abrahamian, thank you very much for your very informative lecture here. I had a question which one of the participants actually asked, and that was the transparency of the British information. And you basically are telling us that there are no, in the MI6, none of the documents are available. I did want to ask you, however, when you mentioned about the Shah being faced with a mafia-like proposition by the Americans, what choice did he have? Could he have, I think his hands were tied. What do you feel that his choices would have been? Thank you.
Thank you. Puyan?
Yes. Yeah, no,
oh, Shukufe, you are here.
Yes.
Okay, Shukufe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abrahamian. We know about the role of the British and CIA. Now, my question is about the role of the Hizb Tudeh. What was the role of the Tudeh party at that time? And was it possible that the coup would be carried out by them? And what were the benefits to the oil companies? Thank you.
Dr. Abrahamian, 5 minutes.
Right. Well, as I was stressing in the CIA documents, they had quite a, I would say, down-to-earth assessment of the Tudeh, that the Tudeh could organize mass demonstrations, could organize strikes, but they were not in a position to carry out a coup, and were not even thinking of a coup. Their policy in Bizarre Mordad was to support Mossadegh. So then later on, the story was built up, but there was a clash between Mossadegh and the Tudeh. That was actually a manufactured history. On Bizarre Mordad, the Tudeh party really followed whatever Mossadegh wanted policy. Mossadegh called for people to stay at home, so the Tudeh stayed at home. It wasn't like they were sulking and trying to undermine Mossadegh when they stayed home. They were obeying what Mossadegh wanted his supporters to do. So I think there's too much role made of actually Tudeh role. There may have been people, ultra-leftists in the Tudeh who thought that they could take over and carry out a revolution, that this was, October 1917 in Iran. But I think the more realistic leaders in the Tudeh party, the people like Iskandari, even Kianuri, were down to earth. They knew that the Tudeh party was not powerful enough to carry out such a coup. In fact, one of the interesting documents that the CIA did on the two-day, they said just before Mr. Mordad that the required reading for rank and file two-day party was Lenin's infantile leftism. They gobbled up the title. They didn't even recognize, the American CIA guys didn't recognize what the book was, but from the title they had, clearly it was Lenin's infantile leftism. So if you're a communist party thinking of a coup, you would not be using Lenin's infantile leftism as a basic instruction manual at that point. So that was certainly not the policy of the two-day leadership. There have been, clearly there were people, ultra-leftists, who talked big at that time, you know, Bezan Bekub and so on. But realistically, there was no possibility of that. Later on, much was made of the Sazman Afsaran Hezb Today, especially after it was unearthed, people were arrested, 600 people were arrested, and people say now, even nowadays, you know, 600 officers, they could have carried out a coup. Again, it creates a false impression. 600 was not much actually in a top-heavy army of 60,000 army officers. And if you look at the people who were tried among the 600, most of them were junior officers, people in the provinces, people, instructions officers in the academy, very few people actually in crucial places, which were, to carry out a coup, you had to have tanks, you have to have aircraft, and Today didn't have that. And Mossadegh in his trial and also in prison said, it's ridiculous to talk about a two-day taking over. They didn't even have a machine gun. How are they going to take over? So Mossadegh did not consider the two-day a threat, more like a force that he could use at convenient times. Then there's always the Soviet, you know, what was the Soviet policy? And if the Soviets did anything, the Americans took it as to be very sinister. They were not doing anything, and therefore the Americans saw this doing nothing as very sinister too.
Thank you. Puyan Rahim Bajogli, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian. What was the position of Dr. Mossadegh about Shah leaving Iran to go to Rome just before the coup? In the book, you write that in the February of 1952, when Shah was going to leave Iran, Dr. Mossadegh told Henderson that Henderson's positions was interference in Iranian affairs. But you don't actually say that what was Dr. Mossadegh's feeling about that, because some authors have claimed that Dr. Mossadegh was going to create a republic and become a president himself. Is there any evidence that Dr. Mossadegh wanted to become the president? And I also wanted to ask that during the oil nationalization, was there any political party or faction in Iran which opposed oil nationalization? And what was specifically what was the position of the Tudeh party about oil nationalization? And is it true that after a period, Tudeh party remained silent about nationalization in their papers? There is an anecdotal story that suggests that Dr. Mossadegh met with Ehsan Tabari at one point and told Tabari that, you know, I will cut off your tongue if you write about nationalizing Northern oil in favor of the Soviet. But the story seems to be too fantastical to be true. Is that the story true? Thank you.
Thank you. Rahim Bajogli.
Thank you, Professor Abrahamian, for your informative and impressive and wonderful presentation on the period of critical Iranian history. I have two questions. One is regarding the New York Times report by Tim Weiner, May 29, 1997, that CIA claimed that they destroyed all file on Iran 1953 on Iran coup. The Central Intelligence Agency, which has repeatedly pledged for more than 5 years to make public the files from its secret mission to overthrow the government of Iran in 1953, said today that it had destroyed or lost almost all of the document decades ago. Did they revise or did they set back their claim that the document was based on the recent document that you said they released? And the second question, you mentioned that the Iranian desk in CIA during the Truman administration and Eisenhower were the same as Roosevelt and Wilbur were in this desk, member of this desk. The AJAC operation, when was start this operation? Was it during the Truman administration or Eisenhower? You said first part was politically to get rid of Dr. Mossadegh, and after that they didn't succeed, they went to military operation. So AJAC is a military operation or both?
Thank you. Dr. Abrahamian, 5 minutes.
All right, I'll start again with the last part and go on. There, under the Truman administration, there are CIA documents about what sort of things to do to undermine Mossadegh or to replace him. And part of these proposals involves actually a military involvement. So right after Siatir, there are, and looking for, they say, a General Naguib. In Egypt, of course, Naguib had overthrown the monarchy and established a republic which was pro-American. So they were looking for a Naguib right in after Siatir. So they looked around. Zahedi became a person they already were looking at as the potential coup leader. So that's actually quite on the Mossadegh. But in terms of actually implementation of the plan and carrying out of the plan, you can say that was not signed off by the president until under Roosevelt. Truman says that Roosevelt, I forget the date he gives, in July something, 53, signed off. Although we can't find that signature, so it's probably Roosevelt, Eisenhower was too cautious, didn't want to dirty his hands, so he never actually signed off. But by early 53, the plans were there, and they were already talking to the MI6 about how to go about it. You could say that Truman never actually signed off because he was still hoping that either Mossadegh would renege and buy a phony nationalization, or there would be a political replacement without a military coup. There's one complication. Usually the Republicans say, well, you know, the idea of coups comes with Eisenhower, with Iran, Guatemala. But there is one person that complicates this. This is Copeland, a CIA official who was sent by Roosevelt to Iran in 52 to scout out the possibility of a coup. And he actually boasts that he'd already done that in Syria, in Damascus. And so that one of the early coups in Syria was, again, according to Copeland, masterminded by him and the CIA, and that would have been in the Truman administration. So I can't say that Truman's administration was averse to military coups on principle. So I think it's more complicated than sort of Republican versus Democrat view of how to deal with so-called troublesome countries. The destruction of the records. Yeah, the CIA has admitted that they said in house cleaning at some point, they destroyed a lot of documents about the coup. What they probably mean is actually nitty-gritty documents about, who was being paid, who what was going on in the last few days of the coup. But in terms of policy of how to carry out a coup, CIA positions on the Mossadegh period, those always clearly survive because they're in the new FRUS in the 1,000 pages. A considerable amount of those are not just State Department documents; they are in fact CIA documents, national security documents. So a lot has survived. It's not like it's disappeared into a black hole. No, it's there.
Thank you. Go ahead. Okay, Amiri Masood Salehi. 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Abrahamian, very insightful presentation. Thank you very much. Just want to start 5 points here that every time we kind of remember or think about 1953 coup, it's a kind of flashpoint that somehow equivalent to the US, totally and uniquely involved there. But when we go back in time and look at the landscape of the political landscape of what was happening there, we notice that there are a number of players in that theater, including, of course, Shah Mossadegh and the opposition parties that played the role one way or the other, and made up that basically that landscape, including, of course, if we look at the what Shah was and where he stands, he was young, inexperienced, and somewhat scared because what British done to his father, he was actually for a few months or sometimes he was skeptical of British basically plan that he was thinking that it's actually against him, and eventually, of course, threw himself into the British arms and the Queen Elizabeth II, as we see now, wrote basically a memo protecting him against that. But when we look at other basically players within that landscape, we will look at the Parliament Majlis that was not cooperating with him. We look at basically the Kudeta party that they continued with crippling strikes throughout the oil basically cities, especially in the south, and then of course the Akhunda, the mullahs that was totally, they were in the hands of the British, and they make up the entire story of some of these players that produced the coup. And then when we look at the coup, even though of course you reference nicely in the book as far as that the players, but it seems that based on what here and we hear about the CIA stories, most of them they are not kind of a realistic baseless. And when we look at the foundation of American involvement in Iran in those years, it was the oil companies that they had the basically the power, and U.S. Didn't have as much power as British, and they even Truman, as we referenced him, pretty much listened to Labour Party that currently at that time, that despite the hardships and the really the extreme exploitation that was happening to the laborers in the oil industry. They went through that process. What we basically listened from these events is that it seems when we collect all these elements together, they don't seem to be a centrally orchestrated, but a kind of a chain of events that led into that disappointment, meaning that we need to kind of, for a true basic collection and verification of what happened in those years, probably we need to go back to Iran itself, not to look for the foreign. Maybe British played a significant role, much less within the US. And I don't believe that, even though that Eisenhower took credit through his CIA for the overthrow and all that, was totally correct, because at that time, the only major industry in Iran was oil industry, and because of that. I just wanted to thank you, Marco. Just one conclusion that, since I don't have time, I just want to kind of conclude that retraction and basically impact of what is being discussed here, it's kind of indirectly legitimizes the current regime in the sense that when we say that, okay, the 1953 coup led to the 1975 revolution, and what we see with Barjam and what's going on between US and it legitimizes the current regime in these only basically with US. Thank you. I had more, but I appreciate your response, Professor Abrahamian. Thank you very much.
مسعود صالحی.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian, and thank you, organizers of this wonderful talk. I have two questions. One is, in examining these documents, did you come across any new information that sheds light on the role of Ayatollah Kashani and Muzaffar Baqai in the coup? And second, if you could possibly give your views on the work of Muhammad Ali Mowahed regarding the, and also Ali Mir Khosrow, if you would like. Thank you.
Yes, actually, the new documents that do have a great deal on Baqai. And Baqai was playing a very double role from very early on. He was meeting with Henderson, buttering up Henderson. Henderson was buttering him up, clearly leaving the impression that Baqai would be a good replacement for Mossadegh. In fact, in the meeting they had in Washington for who would be a good candidate to replace, Baqai was one of the ones mentioned. And he had constant close relations with Henderson right through the period, even during the Ravam crisis. Later on, when Ravam fell, Baqai was calling for the execution of Ravam, but in fact, he had voted for Ravam secretly to become prime minister. So there's a lot of dishonesty there about his posturing. Kashani is more complicated. Kashani is clearly used by the British and the Americans. In fact, you have a whole string of American dignitaries who come to Tehran, always visit Kashani. They butter him up, saying, you know, he's not only a great Iranian leader, he's a great Muslim leader in the world, and so on. And what the strategy, I think, was to use Kashani politically in the Majlis. So as long as the strategy was to replace Mossadegh through parliamentary means, Kashani was used by the US especially. But actually, when it comes to the coup itself, it's striking that his name never comes up. Behbahani is the person who is the conduit for CIA money to go to the Chagukeshan. It's not Kashani. And then they list actually people involved in the actual Mr. Ashton Mordard. Kashani is not mentioned. It wouldn't be because Kashani was opposed to the coup. it's because the CIA didn't trust him enough to get him involved in the actual logistics of the coup. They would have rather kept him outside. But of course, in the radio Tehran, on the day of the coup, one of the speakers was one of Khashoggi's sons. So clearly he was not opposed to the coup. But whether he was instrumental in the coup, I don't buy that argument because there's no evidence of that. After the coup, of course, both Zahedi and the Shah paid personal visits to Khashoggi to thank him. But I don't think that was because thanking him for the coup. It was because of thanking him for his role in opposing Mossadegh in the Majlis, parliamentary politics. So I think he's become a lightning rod, and is not that important in the coup itself. The early question about what role could have the Shah played when a position taken when he was really given the mafia type of choice, are we going for a coup or whether you come or not? He really didn't have a choice. That's why I often compare Shah not to Hamlet-like figure who doesn't know what he's doing, more like a Greek tragedy where the protagonist knows that if they do something, they're doomed, but they have no choice. In Greek tragedies, due to their basically stars or their destiny, in the Shah's role, it's because he's so tied to US role, and he really can't break from that. I mean, he could have, in the final analysis, come out on the day of the coup, given full support to Mossadegh, and that would have actually completely disrupted the coup because the army officers that were involved, the tank officers, were doing it in the name of the Shah. So some of them may have preferred to stay home or had second thoughts about it. But clearly he wasn't, he'd already left the country and it was done in his name, whether he wanted to be involved or not. The idea that somehow the Shah was inexperienced and basically a novice, I'm struck by the earlier documents, 1941. He is a very strong character right from then on. He knows that the only way he is to remain Shah is to take full control over the military, that his base of support is the military. And from day one, he acts as an army officer, always in public wearing uniforms. He keeps distinct interest in weaponry, arms, getting more equipment, more salaries to the officers, getting to know everyone who's promoted above major. So he knows that the basic way of remaining in power is the military. And he's adamant that no politician, especially a politician that is not a Darbari, has a foothold and trespasses on the military. Anyone who does gets stomped. In fact, the reason the Shah hates Ghavam, even in 1942, is because Ghavam tried to take the Ministry of War away from the Darbaris under the prime ministerships. So even the period when the Shah is considered outside politics, throughout 1940s, he is in total control over the military. And this is, of course, why he is very much wedded to the United States. The United States has 3 military missions in Iran, in the army, in the gendarmerie, police, and he makes sure that his favorite officers are sent to the United States for training. They are the ones who get the Sherman tanks, the equipment. And he, and the Western diplomats know that if you talk to the Shah, you don't contradict him on military matters. So they actually advise other diplomats that, you know, don't contradict him on any military issue because he considers himself an expert on military equipment. So the idea that somehow the Shah was inexperienced, childish, unaware of things, and that's after the coup he becomes more and more involved, that's a false impression. What the difference was, before 53, he kept the image that he was a constitutional monarch, but he made sure that the army was under his direct personal control. After 53, he also took over the political control too.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian, Manuche, and Iraj.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian. I have a few questions. I try to be as brief as possible. You indicated that Shah was a political savvy. Now that could be, and is actually used to mean that, to relate the meaning that, or the thought that Shah was supportive of Dr. Mossadegh, or like Dr. Mossadegh. This is what we hear in some of the propagandas. So what I would like to state is distinguishing his political savviness, which was based on realizing the fact that Dr. Mossadegh was popular and he could not dismantle his government and so on and so forth, and continue his legitimacy, as you said. That is different with actually Shah's support for Dr. Mossadegh and his positions. So they're not the same. Mossadegh was a national leader. Shah engaged in any activities that undermined him. The coup itself was just one of them, but in winning elections, in particular for 17th Majlis, Mossadegh wanted the election boards, election laws to change, for example, was promoting that, but no, Shah did not agree to that. So he was fighting tooth and nail to get Mossadegh out of power and bring his own power. That's where he was coming from. But he has just fear, realistic fear of what would happen to him if he takes positions against Dr. Mossadegh. But he was actively working against Dr. Mossadegh. He was just not dismantling his government and so on and so forth. The other thing is, after the coup, Ayatollah Burjuri, as you well written on it, tried to ask basically Shah not to execute Dr. Fatemi and others, but that Shah did not pay attention to that. Shah thanked US for saving his throne. He was thankful for that. So he was not by no means, despite some of the propaganda that we hear, supportive of Dr. Mossadegh and nationalization of oil and so on and so forth. So political savviness, true, he was realistic, but on the other hand, he should not be confused with someone that had sympathy for Dr. Mossadegh. The second question is the transfer of, I believe, $1.5 million from England by Shah to New York. What is the reason that that transfer took place? I know later on he I believe during the election of, during the activities for elected representatives for the 17th Majlis, he transferred like $500 million to Iran, according to what I recall from the book. So that's the second question. Third question on the third force and Khalil Maliki. They were between Tudeh party and Mossadegh, there appeared to be a harmony. They appeared to work together in a way. But there was this effort by CIA and others to create this rift between the two, between Tudeh party and Dr. Mossadegh. نیروی سوم and Dr. Khalil Maliki were actively working on that line. Were they actually among those forces or individuals that had been bought by CIA or not? What do the documents show? Thank you.
Iraj?
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it. The speech was fantastic. Well, the question I have is related to mostly to a couple of things that you said in your speech. One was the basic reason that the United States and Britain created a coup in Iran. The main reason for it, you said one of it was because Soviet Union or communism, another one was because of oil. But in the reality, really was those two reasons for the United States to create a coup in Iran, or there was a third reason for it? Actually, in some document or some reading which I had in the past, and that is mostly related to economic aspect of it, it's I've read that basically United States wanted to take the power of the Britain through the controlling of the oil of the whole Middle East, and Iran was the first country which basically they found the oil in it, and they decided almost 50 years before the coup in Iran to through the banking system to create some sort of the financial colonism or control the world through the finance system. So Britain was in a way, and the United States after World War I, by having the banking system in 1913, creating a Federal Reserve, so they decided to create the whole world under the Federal Reserve and control the world through the monetary system, which basically later on changed the monetary system to dollar system, gold system to dollar system, and then back it with the oil. So is it possible to say the main reason which basically created a coup was decided almost 50 years before the coup in Iran in order to bring all of the world banking system under control of one banking system, which basically is World International, Bank of International Settlement, and the central banking of the world. Thank you very much. If I get some more answer on this one, it would clear my mind on the main reason of the coup in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Abrahamian, please go ahead.
Right, I'll start again from the last, what's fresh in my mind, about the question of the dollar versus sterling and so on. Now, those issues, of course, were settled during the end of World War II. So the dollar basically had replaced the pound worldwide. I'm sure there was, the US would prefer that Iran got everything in dollars rather than sterling and so on. But this never comes out in the discussions. What does come out in discussions, which conventional historians are averse to talking about, what is adamant in the US both oil companies, State Department, Embassy, Henderson, is that nationalization of Iranian oil is not just an attack on British oil interests. It is a direct attack on American oil interests throughout the world. So it has universal consequences to America as much as to Britain. Why? Because if Iran is successful in nationalizing oil, then everyone else is going to start doing the same thing. The Iraqis, the Venezuelans, the Indonesians, the Kuwaitis, even the Saudis will think about nationalization. And this is explicitly stated there. It's quite clear for the nightmare in Washington is that if there is successful nationalization, this is like a disease that is going to spread out, and it'll affect American interests as much as the British. So there's no really conflict between US imperialism and British imperialism because they see it as basically a joint issue. Some of the oil companies in America are as adamant against nationalization as AIOC is, because they say, look, we're going to be the next victims if this is successful. One head of actually a big oil company in America says, we rather Iran became communist than succeeded in nationalizing its oil. So this is an issue that really brings the two together. And there was a misconception in Iran, especially among Mossadegh supporters, that somehow there was a strong differences between Britain and United States, and they could use these differences to play off it. But it's quite clear from their own memos what the Americans state quite obviously in private, not in public, that they are opposed to nationalization. They don't mind using the phrase that Iran has the right to nationalize, but according to their definition of nationalization, control, administration of the oil industry has to be outside Iranian hands. So there is really no difference between the two. So I wouldn't put the stress on the question of dominance of the pound universally. That was already there. The oil issue was become much more serious. And of course, nowadays, oil is nationalized in most countries, but in 1951, 52, it was seen in general circles in the oil business that it would be the end of Western civilization, the world as we know it, if all these small countries nationalized their oil. This was considered a nightmare at that time. And historically, you have to put yourself at that time to see how people saw it. So instead of saying, well, this is a direct assault on our interests, they diverted to talk about the danger of communism, the Soviets threatening to gobble up Iran, and so on. So the other issue about whether I mentioned the Shah had sympathy for Mossadegh. There was no sympathy. It's more realistic Machiavellian politics. The Shah knew, as well as Mossadegh knew, there was a real constitutional difference between their interpretation of the fundamental laws. Mossadegh was basically a child of the Mashrutiyat. The Shah basically wanted to preserve his monarchy and control over the army and return, if possible, to his father's way of rule. So there was no sympathy on that issue. But the Shah was smart enough to know that Mossadegh represented Iranian nationalism on the oil issue. And if he went against him on the oil and Mossadegh, he would then discredit his national legitimacy. So that's where his, I think, savviness comes. He, in fact, tells Henderson at one point, look, Hitler and Stalin could do various things, because he had the public behind him. But I can't go against Mossadegh because the public would not be behind me. This is, I would say, a realistic notion of what his position was. Then the other big question, of course, is raised is, by stressing the US documents, am I stressing too much the US role and minimizing the Iranian role? Now, if anyone claimed that the coup was done purely by Americans, obviously that would be an exaggeration. The 40 tanks that came into Tehran were not run by American army officers. The Chahukeshan in southern Tehran were not American bodybuilders who had been imported to Tehran. They were obviously Iranians. But the question, I think, historically is when a definite act occurs, historical act, what are the definitive participants? Who plays the definitive role? And in this case, I would say the US is the definitive role. Without the US, there could not have been a coup. Now, one can argue, well, what's the British role? I think the British have got basically a raw deal because they've been sort of cancelled out of this narrative. But the idea that somehow Behbahani or Baghai or Kashani could have carried out a coup is just bizarre. There's no way. The documents show that without even telling Zahedi what to do, the coup could not have succeeded. So there, I would say the definitive role is the CIA, and we can't get away from that and say, well, it's, all the Iranians played a role. Sure, they played a role, but the question is, would they have succeeded in this coup? And I think the crucial person, actually, again, Colonel Akhavi, who I would say is the sort of the central to the story. You can't say he played a central role because after the failure of the first coup, he literally had a nervous breakdown. He pulled out his gun to shoot himself. It was General Riahi, who was told that an old friend of his persuaded him to go to a sanatorium, basically under a nervous breakdown. So even he can't be portrayed as having played an important role in the coup because he was ill in hospital, incapacitated in hospital on the day of the coup. So I think the idea that somehow we're distracting the story by focusing on the United States is far-fetched. It's even more far-fetched to say that that actually helps the regime at present to do that. The situation later on becomes very different. I think the US just does not have the role in Iran that it had in 51, 53.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian. Farnoosh, and then Puyan.
Sir, your work is impeccable. خسته نباشین. Is the material and sources of Oil Nightmare by Muhammad Ali Mowahed, خواب آشفته نفت, is it accurate? That's my only question.
It's actually a very detailed study. And of course, he actually worked in the oil company, so he knew the inner hearts of the oil. I think where he overestimates again, the communist threat, as if that was what influenced the United States. I think that he tends to go on the wrong path there. So I would say that my only main criticism of that would be he buys into the communist bogey, which and he thinks the Americans were influenced by that. And the documents show that they didn't accept the threat even in Washington. Not publicly, yeah, but in private, the CIA documents say there is no communist threat. In fact, they're intrigued why the Soviets are so uninterested in Iran.
Yes. Puyan.
There was a good question. I forgot, actually, interesting question about Khalid Maliki. I've been intrigued by that because in the documents, there is often boasting by the CIA that they have not only financed but created a Titoist movement in Iran. Now, whether when they mention that, they mean Baha'i or the actual Niruy Sevom, it's vague. It's possible that it was both. And we do have a memoir from a Niruy Sevom person who says that there are certain gentlemen, Jalili, would come to their meetings and say his financier hated the Tudeh party and he was therefore financing Niruy Sevom. But we know from other sources that Jalili was actually one of the Bosco brothers that worked for the CIA. So there could be a link between the CIA and Niruy Sevom. And the policies of Khalid Maliki, as the questioner pointed out, played into the CIA policy was to make sure that there would be friction between the Tudeh and Mossadegh. So for instance, on the anniversary of Siatir, the idea was to have a joint meeting, and it was Khalid Maliki's insistent that there shouldn't be a joint meeting. And the separate meetings were then used as a bogey that the Tudeh party was even bigger than the National Front and therefore a threat. And again, on the morning of 28 Mordad, Niruy Sevom came out with strange articles saying the threat from the right had finished. The threat now from the Tudeh was the real threat. So this, again, coincidental, but it seems to fit into the CIA strategy. But again, there is no smoking gun there, one could say. You can't say Khalid Maliki was a CIA agent, since after the coup he was also arrested. So it may have been one part of the CIA that didn't know what was happening in the other part. Right? One would have to have more details about that.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian. Delavar, then Persia, and then Puyan.
Thank you so much, Kharam Vakili. Dr. Abrahamian, there was a prior question that I thought you should have answered that I did not hear the answer. The lady who asked you a question said that it was Ihsan Tabari who had told or threatened Mossadegh that we will cut your tongue if you nationalize the northern oil or the oil in the northern part of Iran. Is this correct? The lady asked you if this was a correct statement made by Ihsan Tabari.
I've never heard that. It would be a strange thing to say. Anyway, there was no Soviet oil in the north. I mean, the talk was about getting an agreement that was nixed in the Majlis in 1947. I think the real dispute issue was the slogan in the Tudeh party of nationalizing the southern oil or nationalization of oil. But there was no Soviet oil to nationalize, but there was a slogan there. And I think in the Tudeh party, there was some dispute about that, whether having a slogan just on nationalization of southern oil meant that therefore the Soviets should have the right of oil in the north, but there was no agreement to nationalize. I recently heard actually during the big strike, the 51 strike in the oil industry, the two-day party had issued leaflets to send from Tehran to the south, calling with the slogan, nationalization of Southern oil. And the two-day party in the south actually destroyed these pamphlets coming from the north, because they knew that in the south, among the oil workers, this would have been seen as not quite the same as the Mossadegh slogan of nationalization of oil. But that was soon actually dropped by 1950. The slogan was no longer nationalization of just Southern oil. So that was no longer an issue.
Thank you. Persia?
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I'm 15 years old and I'm recently just learning more about the revolution. But so far, what I know the most is how significant this event is in world history. And I just wanted to know what your opinion was on American schools teaching this significant event and what stance you think they would take on how they would teach teenagers like me, 15, 16-year-olds like me about this, and how that would affect just like general knowledge about the revolution and the events following.
Well, history is important now. What parts of history, what should be taught in schools is a complicated issue. Revolutions obviously are important, and you can't really know the modern world without such revolutions as the French, the Russian, the American, the Chinese. There are not that many revolutions, and the Iranian Revolution is one of the few. But whether the Iranian Revolution stands to that height, that importance, is I'm dubious about that. It's whether it's that important that an average American should learn about the Iranian Revolution, mainly because it doesn't have universal implications. It has a lot of implications for us Iranians who lived or had lived through it. But whether it resonated universally like the French Revolution, the ideas of the French Revolution are universal, so are the Russians, so are the Chinese, even the Cuban. The Iranian Revolution actually is basically localized. It has importance to Iran, maybe Shia communities nearby, but it has hardly any resonance in Africa or Asia or South America. It was very much contained inside Iran. In Iran, people think it has universal implications, but if you look at it historically, it was a message for Iranians, especially Iranians of that generation, and very few people outside that had much resonance to what Khomeini was writing or saying. I mean, the notion of Velayat Faqih, how are you going to sell the notion of Velayat Faqih outside a Shia community? Even within a Shia community, it's limited. Are Sunnis going to listen to Velayat Faqih? Are Catholics, Protestants, Buddhists, Hindus going to sort of perk up their ears when they hear the notion Velayat Faqih? So it's a much more insular revolution than the other big universal revolutions.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian. Puyan, we are getting there. If there is another question from anybody, please raise your hand. And because the second time you can have a question, please raise your hand.
Hi, Dr. I had two questions. Was there any political party or faction in Iran which opposed the oil nationalization? And during the time of the nationalization specifically, what was the position of the Tudeh party? And did the position of the Tudeh change in their writings, in their newspapers? And is it true that after a point, the Tudeh became silent on the issue and they didn't address it anymore? My second question is that what was the position of Dr. Mossadegh about Shah leaving Iran to go to Rome just before the Kudeta? In your book, you write that in the February of 1952, when Shah was going to leave Iran, Dr. Mossadegh told Henderson that Henderson's position on Shah leaving Iran was interference in Iranian politics. But you don't say what did Dr. Mossadegh thought about Shah leaving Iran, because there are some who claim that the issue of Shah leaving and the position of Dr. Mossadegh was that he wanted to create a republic and became the president himself. Is there any evidence that Dr. Mossadegh wanted to become president?
No, actually, the name mentioned for president was not Mossadegh. He would have been quite happy to remain as prime minister. So there were, others may have talked about him as president, but he didn't, that was not a serious name. In fact, there was serious discussion of a writer, a prominent writer being president. Mossadegh also never talked about really a republic. He was set up a committee to look into the issue and what to formulate. So the idea that somehow Mossadegh had Machiavellian engineered this to create himself as a president is far-fetched. There's no real no evidence of that. No. What was the Shah's position when the Shah left in flight? I mean, the Shah basically had to accept that the Shah had left. There were people around him, like Fatemi, who denounced the Shah as a traitor and called him the thief of Baghdad. And that was actually what earned Fatemi his execution later. But the Shah was very careful not to attack the Shah as a monarch. If the Shah had left, it was to be done constitutionally to decide what sort of establishment, whether a republic or another constitutional monarch, that would have to be decided later. It was not something Mossadegh had a blueprint or was going to dictate about to people. The Tudeh position, as I said before, in the early period, the slogan was the nationalization of Southern oil. Later on, it became the same as the National Front, nationalization of oil. So that was no big difference between the two. And as I said, that was not an issue because the others didn't have oil concessions. There was no Soviet concession. And what was drawn up was a tentative talking points, which were nixed in 1947. So after 1947, it was not an issue the Soviets dropped it. In fact, the Americans were surprised that the Soviets basically dropped the whole issue and said, you know, it's your business, you know, that's it. The idea that Tabari confronted Mossadegh about cutting off his tongue, that sounds bizarre because actually Tabari had to flee the country quite early. So during the oil nationalization, Tabari was not in Iran to talk to Mossadegh. So I don't know where that story comes from. It's new to me. I had never heard of that. The idea that Today party then dropped the whole issue of nationalization. Well, it was basically the oil was nationalized. They continued to support the Mossadegh. So what else was it to do? I mean, go into Iraq and nationalize Iraqi oil nationalization. I don't know what would be the policy beyond accepting that oil had been nationalized. Now, were there any political parties that opposed nationalization? Not publicly. There were people who may have sympathized with the British, but no one was willing to actually support the British on this issue. This is why the Shah realized that if he went against nationalization, that would be undermining his legitimacy. What the others did, you know, people like Gerایی and so on, they said, well, the Mossadegh, at first they argued that Mossadegh should come to an agreement what the Americans had offered. But at the same time, they attacked Mossadegh for agreeing to give compensation to the British, a hypocritical position. So on one hand, you're attacking Mossadegh from the right, saying, you know, you should compromise and settle this issue. On the other hand, at the same time, in Majlis, Gerایی, others were saying, no, Abadi was another example of this, that Mossadegh is actually a British agent. Why? Because he's willing to compensate the oil company. And of course, when you nationalize, there has to be some compensation illegally, and Mossadegh was willing to compensate. But the question is, at what rate, how much, when? And this is something that became the nitty-gritty. And the British and the Americans, again, were equally adamant that this would be at a very high price that would make Iran basically politically bound to Britain for the rest of the century, having to pay compensation. And Mossadegh was willing to pay compensation, but at a certain point, at the value of the installations at the time of compensation. And this was then used by people like opponents of Mossadegh to say, hey, you're betraying the country because you're even willing to accept compensation. So it's always best to, if attacking someone from the right, to use a very left position. And then you can say, look, I'm more radical than Mossadegh. I wanted nationalization, but no compensation. At the same time, they were undermining Mossadegh to bring in Zahedi, who was then willing to actually denationalize the oil industry. So you have to take politicians not at their face value, but what they was really actually planning to do, which is often double-crossing, hypocritical, and some of the most bizarre statements you find in the Majlis by some people who were originally part of the National Front.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian. Hassan Shahpari, Ali Dalili.
Yes, this is a very brief comment on Dr. Abrahamian's, and it is a response to a young Iranian female student who was so eager to raise a question to be reflected in a historical books in United States. It was a very dear question to me as a teacher. And I wanted to assure Persia, if she will be available, to be informed that Iranian revolution, under discussion of religious nationalism, has penetrated into introductory sociology textbook that I'm assuring you here that in future she's going to take courses in sociology and social sciences. She will be reading at least one lengthy page on such a topic. As well as I would like also to inform her that when taking liberal studies courses, especially Middle Eastern study courses, she will be one way or the other way exposed fairly well and extensively with the question of Iranian revolution. And she has to be waiting a little bit more to get into college, and she will get a picture of the Iranian revolution through social science textbooks. Thank you.
Ali Dalili.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian, for all your work. There's a couple of things that I wanted to mention. We have this romanticized picture of Mossadegh and the events around 28 Mordad, where we think that it's David versus Goliath, good versus evil, where we have factions that were on the side of God and the factions that were on the side of evil. And we talk about different political factions. We don't talk about the people, the public, the same ones who came out and said, Ya Mard Ya Mossadegh on Tir, on 28 Mordad were nowhere to be seen. Or if they were quite standing by watching the events that were taking place. We see pictures of Mossadegh in court where he's down on the table, exhausted, and there's like a whole array of people standing over him, gladly posing for the photos, pictures to be taken, as if they've killed this lion, and here they were the hunters. If we don't, luckily in Qanun, we have people who were like teenagers during that time, people who were in the part of the religious sector of the society from home. And they actually talk about how their perception of the time was a lot of upheaval, a lot of turmoil, a lot of uncertainty. And it is not the picture like that I grew up with, that here was this hero that we had, Mossadegh, and he was toppled down by the hands of a few thugs, and an Americans just flooded the country with a few $1 million, and everybody sold Mossadegh out to them. There's a lot of bewilderment, and they're puzzled over, like, how could anybody sell their own government or their hero, their democratic elected leader, to a foreign government? And what I would encourage them to do is to look at the political climate today. All these think tanks, all these places that accept money to promote democracy in the region, in Iran, all these people who work for foreign media, do we actually hold any of them say, hey, we hold Kashani responsible, Muzaffar Baqai, as people who are betraying Iran, but we don't point out to what takes place today. We actually defend many of the people, and we say, hey, they're doing the right thing by defending the United States, defending freedom. I think there is this good versus evil aura needs to be pulled back a little, and we should look at realistically as what was really going through the minds of these people, whether it's Muzaffar Baqai, whether it's Kashani, whether it's why were they holding their supporters back? Why weren't they not coming on the streets? And I think this romantic picture does not serve anybody. Even the Shah, who's had his own interests. And I think as a whole, all of us Iranians want Iran to move forward, progress, not be in conflict, in constant conflict. The perception of what we think is important, we believe that we're in constant conflict. Are we really in constant conflict? Or do they make us believe that we're in constant conflict? And if these factions during Mossadegh thought that, here we are. And we see this in Chile with Allende. We saw it recently, if you want to look, in Egypt with Morsi. If the populace believes that they are going the wrong path, maybe they will not support their leaders. Whether they are going the wrong path is another matter. When you have the media in your hand, you're constantly like the entire, when I was growing up to this day, we still sit in front of BBC, we still sit in front of Voice of America or whoever else, and we're just mesmerized by these television stations, and we listen to every word that they say, and we believe that word to be the truth, and we effectively get our guidelines, our instructions from them, and then we come out and we say, they undermine Mossadegh, they undermine Iran, they undermine. And we don't hold ourselves responsible for any of these things. It's always someone else who's doing these things to us, and we are just the poor, sweet little victims. And we have no role, we're impotent, we're incompetent, and are unable to do anything. Thank you. Your comment, I think. Thanks.
Well, I don't know if I don't see history as a drama between good and bad, evil and godly figures or something like that, and somehow the public is confused or wants some leadership. I see basically certain acts in history and try to explain why those acts occurred. So it's sort of spreading the blame or saying, well, we're all responsible, even if we were not alive in Tehran in 1953, somehow we are implicit in what was going on because we were confused or because listened to this or that. It sort of spreads the whole thing to such a level that there is no explanation. Now, often they're saying, well, the public in Iran was very fluid, hypocritical. One day they supported Mossadegh, Siatir, they came out. They didn't come out. So that shows that the public was responsible. If the public was really behind Mossadegh, they would have been there on Mossadegh as they had been in Siatir. This doesn't take into account actually what was happening, what occurred on those days. In Siatir, all the basically progressive forces asked their members to come out into the streets. People did come out into the streets in large numbers. In Mordad, it's not that the public was fickle. The public so decided to stay home because they weren't given good leadership. It was actually a policy of the leadership that they should stay home because Mossadegh had come to the conclusion or had come to the judgment that he had the situation under control. General Riai had told him he had the situation under control. So it's a miscalculation of what happened. As a result of a miscalculation that people were staying home. It wasn't because they were fickle, it was because Mossadegh actually wanted people to stay home. So it's no mystery to say, well, it's the philosophy or the culture, or somehow we have to blame ourselves or someone to say, well, what happened in Bishtasht Mordad is sort of generalized and so on. There were definite reasons why Bishtasht Mordad occurred. And one reason was Mossadegh's mistake of telling everyone to stay home. If they had said, pour out, if he had armed people, there would have been probably a great deal of violence, maybe a civil war, but it wouldn't have been an easy coup the way it occurred. So it's not a question of good and evil in politics. It's usually which is the lesser evil, or who do you think are you most sympathetic to? To think that Zahedi or the Shah on one hand are equivalent to Mossadegh, and somehow the mishmash, their old mixture, is then leaves out the historical context that one person, Mossadegh, was an embodiment of Iranian patriotism and Iranian constitutionalism. The other side was not. So that's a choice. Whether you say that's evil and good is something else. But as a citizen, one has to choose which one really you're on side on, which one you're more sympathetic with. So if you feel that, you know, the monarch as a royal divine authority, he shouldn't be questioned, then obviously the other side is goodness, and anyone who questions that authority is evil. But I think as citizens, it's much more murky, and one has to define what are one's priority in politics and which politician fits that priorities better.
Mute, you are mute. Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Abrahamian, thank you very much for your participation and speech that you had tonight. We really learned a lot. It was one of our best speech in the Kanun, and I recommend to all members and friends that they came tonight, they buy your book and learn more about Mossadegh, Kudeta, and the revolution, and increase their knowledge. It was wonderful. I really appreciate it. And I know that you are tired, but I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.